We do get in habits, don't we? Good evening, everyone. Good to see all of you here this evening. As you know, on Sunday evenings, we have been talking about the 7 churches of Asia. We took a couple of weeks off, one where I was on vacation, and then last week we had a guest speaker and worked on the new song. And so anyway, I thought we would return to our series on the 7 churches, and this evening we're going to be looking at the church of Sardis. But I thought we'd spend just a quick few moments just kind of getting ourselves back familiar with what we have looked at thus far with the 4 churches. As you think about the 7 churches of Asia, I think it's important not just to read them as a historical article, but to realize that these messages, though they are short to these churches, are very applicable to us today, and that they are a reflection of the church of the 21st century. Now, not all of those churches completely reflect us, but parts of all of them probably speaks to us as a church. And so it's almost as though that these letters could have been written to the Meridian church, at least some parts of them. So we have the 7 churches of Asia that you see on the map there: EPHESUS and Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and of course Laodicea. We began by looking at the church of Ephesus. Ephesus was an incredible church in that it refused to compromise in any way those who were false teachers. But in so doing, they probably were seeing a false teacher under every bed, and the result was that they began to leave their first love. And Jesus calls them back to it and calls them, of course, to repent. And then we looked at the church of Smyrna, the persecuted church. That was the church that Jesus said to be faithful unto death, and I'll give you a crown of life. And so of all the 7 churches, they were probably receiving the most severe of persecution, and yet they refused to compromise or even give an inch, and the result of that is that they received zero condemnation and complete commendation from Jesus because of their faithfulness. And then we looked at Pergamum. It was the capital of Asia. It was the capital of emperor worship and had the right of the sword, which means they were able to execute people if a person refused to worship an emperor or to pinch some incense to his likeness. And so the Christians of Pergamum found themselves in a very difficult situation. There was a time when they did stand strong, but now they have given ground to the false teachings of around them, such as Balaam, who led Israel into apostasy or certainly into sin, and of course the teachings of the Nicolaitans, of which Jesus told them to repent as well. Then we looked at the church at Thyatira, and Thyatira is an interesting church in that it's not centered around emperor worship, but they were centered around the trade guilds. They'd almost be like a unionized city, if you will, only their trades were connected to a pagan deity worship. And so almost each trade guild had its own god or a goddess that they worshiped. And those who worked for that trade were expected to fall in line and do the exact same thing. They become a church that would shout how to be effective without being part of the world. The church there didn't do so well at that, but we can. And so that's the encouragement that we see from Thyatira. And that finally brings us to the church in Sardis. The church in Sardis is an interesting church, but before I get there, let me just share a couple things with you. From about the 4th century up and through the 17th century, the church basically almost became almost invisible, except for those who are probably known as heretics. It just kind of fell out of sight, and I think there's a reason for that, and the reason for that is they refused to stand counterculture to the world that was around them. Morally speaking, religiously speaking, as a result of that, they were overrun. Not only were they overran by the society around them, but they were overran by false religion. And I'm not talking about false religion like Baal or Molech or Shamash or any of those kinds of things. I'm talking about Christianity that had become, it had become twisted and perverted. So the church almost was forced in an underground kind of situation until about the 15th century. And in the 15th century, there were those who were known as reformists, and they tried to reform, not tried to recreate the church, but tried to reform, if you will, the Catholic church. And they did a pretty good job of trying to walk away from the church being the authority to looking at the scriptures as the authority for how to live life. And that went really well for about probably a half a century. But then they began to fall back into the same traps as their forefathers, and they began to allow the secular society around them to encroach upon them, and they began to pull back to the degree that eventually, if you were to look at the church in Europe today, especially the Reformed churches of Europe today, you'll find incredible looking structures and incredible looking buildings that are nothing more than museums. That people go on vacation and they go on and they drop their coins there because they just want to see what it looked like. I remember going to Ulrich Zwingli, who was an incredible Reformationist, to walk into his church building. I think it was built in like 1429 or 59 or 79, something like that. It's an old building, and to see, people don't go there to worship on, to study the Bible on a Wednesday night or to worship on a Sunday. It's an absolute empty building. That's true in Holland. That's true in Switzerland. That's true in France. In a lot of the European countries, the churches there have become so secularized or have become so jettisoned that they have no impact whatsoever on the culture that is around them. So then you fast forward and you move to, say, the later part of the 1700s and into the 1800s, and you have a restoration movement that began. And the restoration movement was not about reforming churches. It was all about restoring what the first century church looked like in terms of how they worshiped and how they became Christians and how they lived as Christians and how they governed themselves as Christians, with each congregation being autonomous and each congregation having its elders and its deacons and its ministers and, of course, the working membership, all working together as a unit. They wanted to restore primitive Christianity, if you will. And that's been about 250 years ago, we might say. And so the question we would ask ourselves this evening is, are we allowing the culture to squeeze us? Are we allowing the culture to cause us to shrink back from our first love, or to shrink back from a job that has not been finished, or from a job that we once started and then have ceased to remain in and be faithful about? That's what the church of Sardis was about. The church of Sardis was a church that had a name that it was alive. But Jesus said it was dead, and he told them, you need to wake up to the mission that you have been given, and that which you once started, you need to finish it now. And so there's this great encouragement that comes from the church of Sardis. Sardis was once the capital of the great nation of Lydia. It was a commercial city, which means it was a very wealthy city in and of itself. The kings of that nation, they lived in luxury. They lived in a greatness, if you will. There was something great about Sardis and Lydia and those things, but Sardis began to change itself. Sardis was built upon a smooth, almost perpendicular rock hill that's about 1,500 feet high, towering above the fertile river of Hermus. It's a natural fortress because it's inaccessible on three sides of it, with one side being accessible, but it is extremely well guarded. I found some pictures on the internet of this hill, and you can see three of the precipices, that how they are giant, and then on the back side of it, you see how well guarded it was. And so when you talked about Sardis, Sardis was this city that was so fortified that it didn't think anyone could touch them. They thought that they were untouchable by any foreign armies. The saints, Sardis citizens, were constantly in a state of moral and religious corruption. And the reason why they were locked is because of the deities that they worshiped. In particular, they worshiped Sybil. And they were known for combining wild sex orgies with their worship of heathen gods. It was something that was a promoted kind of thing. It was encouraged, and so the city was morally corrupt in so many ways. They were known as being immoral, as being wealthy, as being wicked, self-indulgent as a society, but they're also seen as being extremely soft. They were soft because they didn't have to survive, because they thought that they could stand on their own wealth. And they thought they could survive because of the height of the city and how well it was guarded. And so many would say of Sardis that it was a sleeping city. And some would say that it was, if you were talking about the church, it was the church that was more like a morgue than a living, active body of Christ. Well, that's Sardis. And the result of the city of Sardis, there is in some ways that the church, Christians there, reflected that city. And so Jesus uses a number of words that are kind of a play on words because of their history that they would know about, that would cause them to think seriously about who they are and what they were doing. So let's look at Revelation, the 3rd chapter, and let's begin reading in verse 1. To the angel of the church of Sardis write, he who has the 7 spirits of God and the 7 stars says this, I know your deeds, that you have a name, that you are alive, but you are dead. Wake up and strengthen the things that remain, which were about to die, for I have not found your deeds completed in the sight of my God. So remember what you have received and heard, and keep it and repent. Therefore, if you do not wake up, I will come like a thief, and you will not know at what hour I will come to you. But you have a few people in Sardis who have not soiled their garments, and they will walk with me in white, for they are worthy. He who overcomes will thus be clothed in white garments, and I will not erase his name from the book of life, and I will confess his name before my Father and before his angels. He who has an ear to hear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. So there is a brief analysis that, as you look at Sardis. The first is this, that Jesus has some condemnation of the church in Sardis. Sardis, the first verse says, had a reputation that they were alive. But he pronounces them as dead. They have a reputation for a city, but they also have a reputation as a congregation, that they are doing so well, that they are alive, that they are vibrant. But Jesus says, I know you, and I know your deeds, and you are dead. Now that's strong language when you think about it, because the chances are you could probably say if Sardis were to have a church building and you were to look or peek into its windows, you would see a church that seemed to be at peace, even though they were resting in peace, rather than possibly being at peace. They seem to be very accepting, very tolerant, very busy, and untouched by the world. But what Jesus is saying is maybe none of that is true. Maybe they are being touched by the world much more than possibly anyone may have thought. So they are told that they are about to die, but he hasn't given up on them. The problem of Sardis in so many ways, and this is just my opinion, looks in many ways like the church of the 21st century. And the reason I'm saying that is there was a time when we, as the church, had a huge reputation as being extremely mission-minded and evangelistically minded. Back in the latter part of the 50s on into the 60s, do you know that the Church of Christ was known as the fastest growing religion in the United States? Do you know we once had a reputation that says if anyone poked you, a Bible passage would come out of your mouth? That was a reputation we had because we were seen as Bible students. And we were seen as those who really took the mission of Jesus very seriously, and we were active. Now, some will say, well, no, that growth was a reflection of those who came after the Second World War. That's post-war activity where people were brought down to the point where they really did consider the things of life and the brevity of life and the importance of life, and more than that, the life, spiritually speaking, of Christians. And so the result of that is, as we looked at the worldwide world that had happened, we saw people in transition all over the place, and we knew that the answer to their transition was Jesus Christ. And so the church became extremely active worldwide in the mission. Today, we're ranked 16th in church growth. And if I were to poke some of you, you may not have a Bible passage come out of your mouth. You might say, quit poking me. So the church, in many ways, can be reflective of Sardis. It can be in many ways. And some of the ways that I would say it's reflective is because of, well, things like no religious stand being taken. Why is it? Because we're not being heavily persecuted. The church back then was being persecuted. Today, there's not much persecution. We have some of those who are on the TV and on news channels will take cheap shots at Christians, but no one's knocking at our doors or threatening to throw us into prison. That doesn't mean it's not coming, especially as we get into some of the countercultural things and the moral stands that we may have to one day stand, especially in areas of sexuality. But today, there's really not a whole lot of persecution comes our ways. You're not going to be fired if you claim to be a Christian at work. Your friends are not going to disown you if you decide to tell them that I am a Christian. They might think you're a Bible thumper. You might think that you're a little bit of a Jesus freak or something like that. That's what they used to tell me anyway, clear back in the early 70s. Now, Richard, are you becoming a Bible thumper now? Are you becoming a Jesus freak? Are you becoming, and to answer all those is, well, I think I am. Which was okay, because I was ready, and I wasn't completely a really young teenager. I was 18 years old, and so I started to move towards that of adulthood and making up my mind about a lot of things. But the church was not being persecuted today. The church back then in Sardis wasn't being persecuted as well. And they, in many ways, were living off their past. They were living coexistently with society around them. And so some have likened it to a nice, harmless church on the corner because they weren't standing against anything. They weren't standing against civil. They weren't standing against sensuality. They were standing against prostitution that was happening within the civil organization. They were standing against those things. And so people just left them alone, and the church left them alone, and they just agreed to get along. That's what's happening today in our world. Do you know that in most of the mainline denominations today that they have completely erased out all their fidelity clauses? Just erased them right out. Our society did that a long time ago where adultery and fornication is just accepted. That's what people are going to do. But in a lot of the mainline denominations, they have struck out those fidelity clauses that have to do with homosexuality or ministers serving as homosexuals or marrying people who are homosexuals and things of that nature. They just completely rolled over in order that they might just get along with the society in which they live. After all, that's what the society is promoting and pushing. So why should the church get in the way of that? But what if we decide to be countercultural? What if we decide that we're going to take a stand and that we're going to stand where God stands in the scriptures on subjects like I just mentioned? Where are we going to be then? Mainline churches have rolled over in terms of women's roles within the church and taken leadership roles where God has simply said, listen, I don't allow a woman to teach or usurp authority over a man. That was an apostle that said that. I remember a man that was a pretty good teacher once says, well, that's Paul's opinion. No, that's not Paul's opinion. Paul is an apostle. He speaks of it, the Holy Spirit or Jesus himself is speaking when he wrote those things over there in 1 Timothy, the 2nd chapter. Another person says, well, listen, they're not usurping authority if you as elders give them the authority to lead like a man. To which I said to this elder, where do you as an elder usurp the authority of an apostle? Who said he didn't allow that. Taking stands, and that's what the church of Sardis was not doing. They were not taking a religious stand. They were living off their past. They once had been active, looked active, but then they quit working. There was greater concern with the cosmetics than it was with their character. It was better for them to have a nice looking, if you would, a church building, or dress right as Christians, cosmetically speaking, than it was to be the church that stood up for that which is right in the sight of God. So you get the idea of what I'm talking about here. So as you look at this first part of chapter 3, there it says, to the angel of the church of Sardis. I think that it's probably some weeks back when we talked about the angel there, he's not talking necessarily about an angel. The word angel, there comes the word angeloi, which means a messenger. So there's probably a messenger within the church that's supposed to bring a message, and they're supposed to stand on principles and stand on the scriptures and teach the church. He who has the 7 spirits of God and the 7 stars says this, I know your deeds, that you have a name, that you are alive, but you are dead. Wake up and strengthen the things that remain, which are about to die, for I have not found your deeds complete in the sight of my God. Things had started. They were rolling, but then they stopped rolling. And so Jesus comes along, and he gives them some correctional counsel. And the first thing he tells them is that they are supposed to wake up. The idea of waking up is really a play on words. Remember I said to you that there were 1,500-foot precipices on 3 sides of that mountain which the city was built, and on the backside was extremely well fortified. Because of that, they didn't think anyone could touch them, except for they were attacked and overrun twice in their history. Cyrus the Great at one time did that, and then Antiochus the Great, he did it just a few years later. I think it was 330 BC when Cyrus went up against Sardis. As he went up against Sardis, he began looking at the city, and he saw that it was well fortified on the backside, but there are these 1,500-foot precipices that were there, cliffs that were there, and so how is he going to attack this city? And so he said to his troops, he says, if any man finds a way up to Sardis, you'll be well rewarded. There was a fellow by the name of Hieronymus who found that way. He was sitting, and he's just been sitting, watching Sardis and watching the cliff, watching day in and day out, watch. And then one day he saw a soldier look over the side of the city walls, and his helmet fell off. And it goes all the way to the deck. And Hieronymus, he decides to sit on the helmet. Now, when I say sit on the helmet, he's not sitting on the helmet. He's watching the helmet. And then he sees a guy at the top, a soldier who had lost the helmet, begins to make his way down through a crack in the crevice. And he watches him, and he draws a map of his descent. And he draws the map of his ascent. And then he goes and tells Cyrus. Cyrus makes him a rich man. And in the dead of night, the armies of Cyrus, they went up those crevices, climbed up, went over the walls, because guess what was happening in Sardis? Everyone was asleep. Even the soldiers are asleep. Why? Because they feel like no one can touch them. They're well protected, so they sleep. And so Cyrus and his armies went into Sardis and took her and never fired a shot. Years later, Antiochus the Great will do the exact same thing. So Jesus knows their history. And so he tells them, you need to wake up. You need to be alert. You need to be vigilant. You need to make sure you are testing yourself. Think about 2 Corinthians, the 13th chapter, and verse 5, where Paul says, test yourself to see whether you are of the faith, unless you are afraid that you will fail. How's that for a challenge? That's what Paul writes to the Corinthians. Test yourselves. See if you are of the faith, or are you afraid of something? Are you afraid that you might fail? Well, he's asking us as a church. Jesus is asking as a church, test yourselves. Is there a chance that you need to wake up? Is there a chance that you have started something that maybe you have not finished yet? You need to strengthen or establish the things that remain, is what Jesus is saying to them. a few of the individuals, obviously, as you look at verse 4, have remained awake. And he tells them to, listen, it's not over yet. You haven't become a morgue yet. You're not completely dead. There are those who remain. Those who remain, you need to start shaking your brethren around you. You need to start waking them up to what's going on. You know, there's times when I look out in the audience and I'll see someone that kind of has drifted off. There's reasons for that, okay? It could be sometimes he didn't sleep very well that night. Sometimes they might be taking some kind of medication, or maybe they have narcolepsy or whatever. But sometimes people just drift, you know. When I was a young preacher, I'd probably try to wake them up. In fact, I think I did. I used to slam pulpits and drop Bibles and all kinds of stuff. I don't do that anymore. I figure people's got their own stuff going on there. But spiritually speaking, we need to, I think about that. Do we need to wake up? Do we need to strengthen? Do we need to remember what our purpose is? So what is the purpose? Well, the purpose is the same purpose that it's always been, and that is to reach out to those who are lost. If you look at verse 2, it says, wake up and strengthen the things that remain, which were about to die. It hasn't dead yet, but it's about to die. For I have found your deeds completed or perfected in the sight of my God. I have not found your deeds perfected or completed in the sight of my God. This word here for completed is the word pleiro, and it's a word that means to bring to completion or to finish up. And so what was it that the church in Sardis had received? Well, they had received the gospel, the good news. And they, in obedience to their faith, had become Christians. But then they were given a mission. And that mission is the same mission that we would have today. And that, of course, would be reaching out to those who are lost. And so we might ask ourselves, well, what about us today? What about our congregation? How are we doing in that area? Now, I know that we've went through a year and a half of coronavirus. And so there are some reasons for why we've had to almost in a forced way shrink back from some things. But as we are beginning to open up, okay, are we starting to think now about our mission? Are we starting to think about the things that we need to be doing as a congregation? Just think about that, if you will. We need to apply the truth of the good news of Jesus. We need to change, they need to change their direction. They're going in a negative direction. He says, you need to change your direction. And so he warns them. So Jesus warned them that if they hesitate or refuse to take the prescribed actions to free themselves and to conquer their assailants, he would come to them in judgment at a time that they would not expect. In fact, he says, I'll come like a thief. And no one knows when a thief doesn't knock on your door and say at 10 o'clock tonight, I will be there. Or 3 in the morning, I will be there. It says, I'll come like a thief. And so you need to be ready. So Jesus promises them and commits this to them as an everlasting promise. Look at verse 5. He who overcomes will thus be clothed in white garments, and I will not erase his name from the book of life, and I will confess his name before my Father and before his angels. So he promises everlasting righteousness. Notice he says, I will clothe them in white. That's impurity. And so those who are clothed in white, they receive a promise that there's going to be an everlasting citizenship that is for them. And that's why he says, your names will not be erased out of the Lamb's book of life that's enrolled in heaven. And that there is this everlasting affirmation. And this everlasting affirmation, as he says, is that here's my promise to you. Your names will be in the book of life. And on the day of judgment, I will confess you before my Father that you're one of mine. It's almost reflective of Matthew, the 10th chapter and verse 32, where Jesus says, if you confess me before men, I'll confess you before my Father. If you deny me before men, I'll deny you before my Father and before his angels who are in heaven. So there's that promise that is given to us. And so that, in a nutshell, is the church in Sardis. A church that really does causes, at least it causes me to think about my own life. And to think, have I become sleepy? Have I compromised? Have I got lazy or lethargic about my faith? And if so, then there's that shaking that is going on. Jesus, he doesn't do like he did in the Reformation movement or in the early church years or in the Reformation or in the Restoration movement. He comes right out Sardis, and face to face, he jogs them and tells them to wake up. So that's the lesson for this evening, and your response is yours. Do you need to wake up? If so, why not do it right now where together we stand and sing?